I had been out with some friends, enjoying a quiet evening, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Eric, my son's friend, asking if he could drop Josh, my 20-year-old son, home. It was a stormy night, with rain pouring heavily outside, making me anxious about them driving in such conditions. I told Eric to be careful, and soon after, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. When I opened the door, I saw Eric struggling to support Josh, who was clearly very drunk. Josh's clothes were soaked, and he could barely keep his eyes open. Eric, a tall, lanky young man, managed to guide him inside, apologizing for Josh's state. "He had a bit too much tonight," Eric said, voice steady but concerned. I nodded, more worried about Josh's condition than anything else. Together, we managed to get Josh up to his room. He was mumbling incoherently, barely aware of what was happening around him. I helped him out of his wet clothes and tucked him into bed, hoping he would sleep it off. Eric stayed for a moment, making sure Josh was okay, before heading back out into the stormy night. The next morning, Josh was groggy, but otherwise fine. He didn't remember much about the night before, just that he had been out with Eric and their group of friends. I didn't think much more about it at the time, just relieved that he was safe. But a year later, everything changed. I was watching TV one evening when a news report caught my attention. The reporter was talking about a murder that had taken place in a small motel nearby. My heart skipped a beat as I listened. The victim had been found in his room, and the police were searching for a friend who had checked him in the night before. A chill ran down my spine when they showed a sketch of the suspect. It looked just like Eric. I felt sick to my stomach. Could it really be him? I immediately called Josh and told him to turn on the news. Moments later, he called back, his voice filled with shock. What do we do?" he asked, fear evident in his voice. "We need to call the police," I replied, trying to stay calm despite the panic rising within me. We contacted the authorities, and soon detectives were at our house, asking questions about Eric. Josh told them everything he could remember from that night a year ago when Eric had brought him home. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. Eric had not only gotten his friend drunk, but had also checked him into the motel where the crime took place. The brutality of what happened was beyond anything I could have imagined. Josh was devastated, struggling to reconcile the friend he thought he knew with the monster that Eric had turned out to be. Weeks went by as the search for Eric continued. Our small town was buzzing with gossip, and it felt like everyone was watching us, wondering how we could have been so close to someone so dangerous. Josh became more withdrawn, spending most of his time alone in his room. I tried to be there for him, but there was little I could do to ease the pain. One night, as we sat in the living room in silence, Josh finally spoke. "Mom, you think I could have been next?" His voice was quiet, filled with fear and doubt. I didn't know how to answer him, but the thought had haunted me as well. I took a deep breath and said, "I don't know, Josh, but you're safe now, and that's what matters." Eventually, the police found Eric. He had fled to another state and was hiding out in a rundown motel. His arrest brought some relief, but the damage was already done. The trial was long and harrowing, with details of the crime coming to light that were almost too much to bear. Eric was sentenced to life in prison, but for Josh and me, life would never be the same. The experience left us both scarred, struggling to move forward. Josh tried to rebuild his life, but the fear and betrayal he felt lingered, casting a shadow over everything. Even now, years later, the memory of that night and the events that followed still haunt us. We've tried to move on. The scars remain, a constant reminder of the darkness that can hide within the people we think we know. Before we get into the next story, if you're new to our channel, please make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more upcoming scary stories. We need your support, so please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks for watching. Last winter, my friends and I decided to go for a late-night drive, hoping to break the monotony of the holidays. It was a chilly, foggy night, and the mist made everything seem mysterious. There were 3 of us in the car, me, Chris, and Emma. We drove around aimlessly, chatting and laughing. But soon the conversation turned to urban legends. Someone brought up an old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. "Let's check it out," Chris suggested, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Despite feeling uneasy, we agreed, and Emma, who was driving, turned onto the winding road leading out of town. The closer we got, the thicker the fog became, and the road grew narrower. Tall, leafless trees lined the path, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Finally, we saw it. The old hospital, its walls covered in ivy and the windows shattered. It loomed at the end of a cracked, overgrown parking lot. The car's headlights barely pierced the fog, casting eerie shadows on the building's crumbling facade. We parked the car a little distance away, not wanting to get too close. As we approached the hospital, the air grew colder, and every sound seemed amplified. Crunch of gravel under our feet, the rustle of leaves in the wind. My heart raced, and I could sense my friends were just as nervous. We reached the entrance, where the door hung ajar. Chris pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The dim light from outside barely reached inside, casting long shadows on the debris-strewn floor. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water from somewhere deep within the building. We decided to split up and explore. Emma and I headed upstairs while Chris stayed on the ground floor. The stairs creaked with every step, and the sound echoed through the empty halls. Upstairs, we found rooms filled with old medical equipment covered in dust, broken beds, and graffiti-covered walls. It felt like the hospital was holding on to its dark past, the remnants of its former life still lingering in the air. Emma and I moved cautiously from room to room, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. In one of the rooms, I noticed an old, rusted medical chart on the floor. I picked it up, but the writing was too faded to make out. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the building, making us both jump. My heart pounded as we called out to Chris, but there was no response. We hurried back down the stairs, finding the entrance now closed. We hadn't heard it shut, and a sense of dread settled over us. We called for Chris again, our voices trembling, but only silence answered. We moved through the dark corridors, checking every room. The operating room was empty, as was the reception area. Finally, in a small storage room near the back of the hospital, we found Chris. He was standing motionless, staring at something in the corner. When we approached, we saw what had caught his attention. A hidden trapdoor in the floor, slightly ajar.
"Did you open that?"
I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Chris shook his head, his face pale. It was like that when I found it. A cold draft blew up from the trapdoor, sending chills down my spine. The darkness below seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. Against our better judgment, we decided to see what was down there. The old wooden ladder groaned as we descended into the basement. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were lined with rusting shelves. In the corner, we noticed a faint glow, a small, flickering light. As we cautiously approached, we saw an old oil lamp hanging from a hook in the wall. It cast just enough light to reveal the room, filled with old hospital files and broken furniture. Suddenly, we heard footsteps above us. My heart stopped. Someone else was in the hospital. We turned off our flashlights, standing frozen in the darkness. Footsteps grew louder, moving closer to the trapdoor. We held our breath, hoping whoever it was would leave. But then the trapdoor creaked open, and a figure appeared at the top of the ladder. A man, tall and gaunt, with wild hair and eyes that gleamed in the dim light. He began descending the ladder, and we backed away, trying to stay out of sight. The man moved slowly, as if searching for something, muttering words we couldn't understand. We needed to get out. The only way was past him. Suddenly, the man stopped and looked straight at us, a twisted smile spreading across his face. Panic surged through us, and we bolted for the ladder, scrambling up as fast as we could. Emma went first, then Chris, then me. As I reached the top, the man grabbed my ankle, pulling me back down. I kicked wildly, and Chris and Emma grabbed me, pulling with all their strength. I managed to break free, and we slammed the trapdoor shut, locking it with a heavy iron bar. We didn't stop running until we were back at the car. Emma started the engine. We sped away, the hospital disappearing into the fog behind us. No one spoke on the way home, each of us lost in our thoughts. The thrill of the night had turned into a nightmare, one we would never forget. Even now, whenever I pass the outskirts of town, I can't help but feel a chill, remembering the man's eerie smile and the terror that still haunts my dreams. I had been working the night shift at a small convenience store on the edge of town for a few months. The work was simple: restocking shelves, keeping the place clean, and helping the occasional customer. Most nights were quiet, with only a handful of people coming in to buy something quick. One night, as I was getting ready to close up, I noticed something strange. The air felt heavy, like it was thick with something I couldn't see. Tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Around midnight, just as I was about to lock the door, an old beat-up truck pulled into the parking lot. A middle-aged woman with short, graying hair stepped out, wearing a long, dark coat that seemed too heavy for the season. She moved slowly, as if every step was a struggle. I greeted her when she entered, and she gave me a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. She wandered around the store, and I went back to my tasks. After a few minutes, she came up to the counter with a pack of batteries and a single candy bar. "Is that all?" I asked, ringing up the items. She nodded but didn't look at me. Her eyes seemed to be focused on something far away. As I handed her the change, she suddenly grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Her hand was cold, like she had been standing outside for hours. "Something dark is coming," she said in a low, raspy voice. "You need to be careful. They're watching you." I pulled my hand back, shocked by her words. She didn't say anything else, just took her things and left, leaving me standing there, heart pounding in my chest. I watched her drive away, the taillights of her truck fading into the night. I tried to brush off the encounter, telling myself she was just some eccentric woman, but her words... As I closed up the store and drove home, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see her truck following me. The night seemed darker than usual, and the familiar route to my apartment felt unfamiliar and unsettling. When I finally got home, I quickly locked the door and checked the windows, feeling a strange sense of unease. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every little noise in my apartment made me jump, and I kept thinking about the woman's warning. It felt like something was lurking in the shadows, waiting. The next day, I told a friend about the encounter. He laughed, saying the woman was probably just messing with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Over the next few nights, the strange feeling of being watched didn't go away. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was all in my head. But one night, as I was stocking the shelves, I heard a soft whisper. I spun around, but the store was empty. The whispering continued, growing louder. I couldn't understand the words. It felt like they were coming from all around me. Suddenly, I felt a cold presence behind me, and my heart started to race. I turned quickly. There was no one there. The lights in the store flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then I heard the door chime, and I turned to see the woman standing there again, just inside the entrance. Her eyes locked onto mine, and she started walking towards me. "They're here," she whispered, her voice sending chills down my spine. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. She reached out, her hand brushing against my arm, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Without thinking, I turned and ran out of the store, not stopping until I was in my car with the doors locked. I drove home in a daze, her words repeating in my mind. When I finally reached my apartment, I bolted the door and sat in the darkness, trembling. I never saw the woman again, but the fear she left me with never really went away. Her warning haunts me to this day. I can't shake the feeling that something dark is still out there, watching, waiting. A few years back, when I was about 26, I decided to make a change in my life. I was stuck in a rut, with college debt and no luck finding a decent job. The small town in Washington where I lived felt suffocating, and I needed to escape. A friend suggested I try volunteering on farms abroad, so I gave it a go. The idea was simple: work a few hours a day on a farm, and in return, you'd get food and a place to stay. Plus, I'd be surrounded by people from all over the world, which sounded like a great way to break out of my shell. After spending a few months working on farms in Oregon and California, I saved up just enough to buy a ticket to a new place. I wanted to go somewhere completely random, so I let a website pick a destination for me. It chose a small town in Poland. I had no clue what to expect, but that only made me more excited. I found a farm online that seemed like a good place to stay. The pictures showed a cozy cottage surrounded by green fields, with a small family and some animals. It looked peaceful, so I decided to go for it. When I arrived in Poland, it took me nearly a day to reach the farm. The roads were rough, and the weather was gloomy, with dark clouds and a light drizzle that never seemed to stop. The farm was in a remote area, far from any town. As I walked up the muddy path, I saw the cottage in the distance. It looked old and run down, nothing like the pictures I had seen. The fields around it were overgrown with weeds, and there were no signs of life, not even the animals that were supposed to be there. A man named Marek greeted me at the gate. He was in his mid-40s, tall and lanky, with a serious expression that didn't match the friendly tone in his emails. He showed me around the property, speaking in broken English. The place was a mess. The barn roof had caved in, and the house smelled damp and moldy. Marek mentioned that his wife and kids were away visiting family, which struck me as odd, since the farm didn't seem like it had been lived in for a while. That night, after a simple meal, I went to bed exhausted. I was so tired that I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a faint, metallic scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor below. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sound continued, echoing through the empty house. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind or the old house settling, and eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, Marek seemed tense. He asked me to help fix some things around the house, but his instructions were vague, and he kept avoiding eye contact. He said he needed to go to the nearby village to get supplies, leaving me alone on the farm. As soon as he left, I started to feel uneasy. The silence of the place was unsettling, and without any phone signal, I felt completely cut off from the world. I decided to explore the house a bit more and notice things that didn't add up. The photos on the walls were old and faded, showing people I didn't recognize. Furniture was broken and covered in dust, and there were strange stains on the floor that made me feel sick to my stomach. I checked the listing on my phone again, and it didn't match what I was seeing. The house in the photos looked clean and well kept, nothing like the decaying place I was in. As I was packing my things to leave, I heard voices outside. I looked out the window and saw 3 men walking up the path toward the house. Panic set in, and without thinking, I grabbed my backpack and slipped out the back door. I ran down the steep hill behind the house. I could hear the men talking, their voices growing louder as they got closer. I hid behind a thick bush, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The men were searching the house, and it sounded like they were angry. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew I had to get out of there. After what felt like hours, the voices faded, and I slowly made my way back to the path. When I was sure they were gone, I started running, not stopping until I reached a paved road. I was miles from the nearest town, with no idea where I was. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, a car pulled up. Inside was a kind elderly couple who offered me a ride. They didn't speak much English, but they could tell I was scared, and they took me to the nearest town. The farm listing disappeared from the website a few days later, and I never heard from Marek again. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something very wrong was happening on that farm. A few years ago, I moved into a quiet neighborhood with my dad and stepmom. We weren't used to the peaceful surroundings, having lived in the city for most of our lives. The house was on the edge of a thick forest, which made it both exciting and a bit eerie for me. My stepmom was thrilled about the idea of starting fresh and raising some pets. so we bought a few chickens and rabbits, letting them roam around the backyard. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. The animals enjoyed their freedom, and there were no issues. But one morning, as I was feeding them, I noticed that 2 of our chickens were missing. There were no feathers or any signs of a struggle, just gone without a trace. We thought maybe they had wandered off into the woods and would come back later, but days passed, and they never returned. One evening, just before sunset, a thick fog rolled in, covering the entire area in a heavy mist. My dad and I were inside when we suddenly heard the distant clucking of a chicken coming from the forest. Thinking it might be one of the missing chickens, my dad grabbed a flashlight, and we headed out to investigate. As we got closer to the edge of the forest, the sound grew louder but seemed to move deeper into the woods. I felt uneasy, but we pressed on, hoping to find our chickens. We eventually reached a small clearing, and the sound abruptly stopped. My dad shone the flashlight around, but there was nothing, just the dense fog and silence. As we stood there, we suddenly heard a soft, eerie humming sound from the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, almost like a low whistle. My dad and I looked at each other, both confused and a bit scared. Without warning, the flashlight flickered and then went out, leaving us in complete darkness. We were about to turn back when we heard footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate. We spun around, but again, there was nothing there. The footsteps continued, this time moving around us in a circle. My dad whispered for us to leave immediately, and we started walking back quickly, trying not to run. As we neared the edge of the forest, the humming grew louder, almost deafening. I felt a cold breeze brush against my neck, and when I turned to look, I saw a faint, glowing figure in the distance. It was crouched down, its eyes locked onto us. My dad didn't hesitate. He grabbed my arm, and we sprinted out of the woods. When we got back to the house, we locked the doors and windows, our hearts racing. The fog had lifted by then, but the eerie feeling remained. We never found our chickens, and after that night, my stepmom made sure we stayed away from the forest. To this day, I still wonder what we encountered in those woods, but I'm not eager to find out. It was a chilly autumn day when I found myself walking through the old cemetery near my neighborhood. I wasn't someone who visited cemeteries often. Something had been pulling me there the past few days. I wasn't sure what it was, but the urge to go grew stronger with each passing moment. The sky was overcast, with dark clouds hanging low, threatening rain. The wind was biting, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. As I walked through the winding paths between the headstones, I noticed how quiet the place was. It wasn't the peaceful silence I had expected. Instead, it was heavy, like the air before a storm. I wasn't visiting anyone in particular, just wandering, lost in thought. The cemetery was old, with many of the graves dating back over a century. The headstones were worn, their inscriptions faded, and the trees that lined the paths were tall and ancient, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms. I came across a grave that looked newer than the rest, and for some reason, I felt compelled to stop. The headstone was simple, just a name and dates, nothing more. I stared at it for a while, feeling a strange sense of unease creeping up on me. The wind picked up, causing the leaves to swirl around my feet, and I shivered, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. As I stood there, lost in thought, my phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket. The sound was jarring in the quiet, and I fumbled with it, surprised to see an unknown number on the screen. Hesitantly, I answered it. "Hello?" I said, my voice sounding small and uncertain. There was a brief silence on the other end, and then I heard a voice I recognized immediately. "Why are you here?" Voice asked, slow and deliberate. It was the voice of my best friend Jake, who had died in a car accident a few months earlier. My heart skipped a beat and I nearly dropped the phone. Couldn't be him. It wasn't possible. But the voice was unmistakable, so familiar that it sent chills down my spine. "Who is this?" I stammered, but the line went dead before I could get an answer. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. It had to be a prank, I told myself. Deep down, I knew it wasn't. The voice had been too real, too familiar to be anyone else. My legs felt weak, and I leaned against a nearby tree, trying to steady myself. The next day, couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The memory of that voice haunted me, echoing in my mind. I knew I had to go back to the cemetery, even though every instinct told me not to. I needed to see Jake's grave, to reassure myself that it had all been in my head. When I arrived, the sky was gray, and the wind was colder than the day before. The cemetery looked the same, but as I walked the path, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. As I approached Jake's grave, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing a few feet away was a figure, someone who shouldn't have been there. It was Jake, or at least it looked like him. He stood there, just as I remembered him, his hands in his pockets, his expression blank. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. His eyes were hollow and his face was unnervingly still, like he wasn't really alive. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. The figure took a step toward me, and that's when I finally found the strength to move. I turned and ran as fast as I could, wind howling in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and even then, I couldn't stop shaking. I never returned to that cemetery. Whatever I saw that day, whatever called me on the phone, it wasn't Jake. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been disturbed. The memory of that day lingers in my mind, a reminder that some things are better left alone. A few summers ago, I decided to take a short trip to clear my mind from work stress. I booked a small cabin about 5 hours from my place, hoping for some peace and quiet. The cabin was in a remote area with only a couple of other houses scattered far apart. Dense trees surrounded the place, creating a perfect secluded spot for relaxation. The weather was warm, with a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves as I arrived in the afternoon. I spent some time exploring the cabin and its surroundings, enjoying the tranquility. As the evening approached, I sat on the front porch, sipping a cold drink and soaking in the serene atmosphere. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, I noticed someone moving between the trees in the distance. It was an older woman, wearing a long dress, slowly making her way through the woods. She seemed out of place, but I assumed she was just one of the few neighbors exploring the area. After a while, I went inside to make dinner. While eating, I heard a faint knocking on the front door. Surprised, I got up and opened it. The same woman I had seen earlier was standing there. She had a friendly smile and asked if I could help her find her way back home. She claimed she had gotten lost and needed directions. Something about her made me uneasy, but I couldn't pinpoint why. "Sure, let me grab my phone," I said, closing the door to fetch it. When I returned just a few moments later, she was gone. I stepped outside, looking around, but she was nowhere to be seen. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Feeling unnerved, I locked the door and tried to focus on a movie to distract myself. That night, I struggled to sleep, constantly replaying the strange encounter in my mind. The next morning, I went back to the porch with my coffee, trying to shake off the weirdness from the previous night. But soon, my unease returned. The same woman was walking in the woods again, following the same path as before. I watched her, realizing she wasn't lost. What was she really up to? I called a friend, explaining what had happened, hoping for some reassurance. As we talked, there was another knock at the door. My heart pounded as I whispered to my friend what was happening. I went to the door and, sure enough, it was her again. "Can you help me find my way back?" she asked with that same unsettling smile. I shut the door quickly, telling my friend what was going on. They urged me to leave immediately. I packed my things in a rush, feeling more anxious with every passing second. Before heading out, I checked through the window to make sure she was gone. Satisfied that the coast was clear, I hurried to my car and drove away as fast as I could. As I glanced back at the cabin one last time, I saw her standing at the window, watching me leave. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been planning something sinister. Even now, I still wonder what she really wanted and why she kept coming back. My name is Brandon, and I live in a small, close-knit town where everyone seems to know each other's business. I've always loved hosting game nights at my place, bringing friends together for fun and laughter. One chilly autumn evening, I decided to invite my closest friends over for another game night. Little did I know that this night would unravel into a mystery that would haunt me for years. I spent the day getting everything ready. The living room was set up with snacks and board games, and the smell of hot cocoa filled the house. As the sun dipped behind the clouds, casting a cool, dim light through the windows, my friends started to arrive. Alex, Josh, Emily, and Chloe were all there, along with a new guy, Ryan, who had recently moved to town. Ryan was an interesting character, quiet and a bit mysterious, but I figured including him in the group might help him feel more at home. He seemed pleased to be invited, and I hoped he would enjoy the evening. We gathered around, started playing games, and soon the room was filled with laughter and friendly competition. Ryan was quieter than the others, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Just seemed a little shy, or maybe he wasn't into the games as much as we were. As the night went on, I noticed Ryan's mood starting to shift. He became tense, barely spoke, and kept avoiding eye contact. I thought about asking if he was okay, but I didn't want to put him on the spot in front of everyone. Suddenly, Ryan stood up, mumbled something about needing to leave, and hurried out the door without saying goodbye. The door slammed behind him, leaving us all in stunned silence. We were confused but tried to brush it off, though the mood had definitely changed. The night eventually wound down and everyone left, still puzzled by Ryan's sudden departure. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to check on Ryan, just to make sure he was okay. I went over to his place and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. His car was parked outside, but the house seemed empty. Figuring he might need some time alone, I left. Days passed, and no one heard from Ryan. I reached out to my friends, but they hadn't seen or heard from him either. Growing more concerned, I called the police and reported him missing. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but weeks turned into months with no sign of Ryan. The police searched his house, talked to neighbors, and followed every lead, but it was like he had just disappeared. I couldn't stop replaying the events of that night in my mind, wondering what had gone wrong. Had I missed something? Was there something I could have done to help him? Determined to find some answers, I began looking into Ryan's past. I found out he had moved to our town after a rough breakup, hoping for a fresh start. He didn't have many friends, and his family was far away. The more I learned, the more I realized how little I knew about him. One night, while I was home alone, I heard a strange noise outside. It was a soft rustling, like someone was moving through the leaves. My heart started racing as I looked out the window, but all I saw was darkness. The noise stopped, and I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the noises continued in the following nights. Footsteps, whispers, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. I barely slept, feeling on edge all the time. Then, one evening, I found a notebook in Ryan's house that the police had missed. It was filled with his thoughts, revealing a troubled mind. He wrote about feeling out of place, not just in our town but in life. His entries grew darker, filled with fear and paranoia. The last entry was from the night of our game night. It read, "I can't stay here. Something's following me. I have to leave before it finds me." Reading those words sent chills down my spine. What had Ryan been so afraid of? I gave the notebook to the police, but it didn't give them any new leads. Their investigation went cold, and life in our town went back to normal, at least for everyone except me. I couldn't let it go, haunted by the mystery of what had happened to Ryan. Even now, I sometimes find myself staring into the dark, listening for those strange noises, wondering if Ryan is out there somewhere, lost and scared. My friends try to comfort me, but the unanswered questions linger. Ryan is gone, and we may never know what happened to him. That game night, which should have been just another fun evening, has left a shadow over my life. A reminder that even the most ordinary moments can lead to the most unsettling mysteries.